Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Guerrilla Intellectual University here at Black Power Media. I'm Jared Ball. Happy to be joined by Kalanji Jamachanga and, of course, Dr. Joy James. Greetings, everybody. Good morning. How you all doing?
Hey, man.
Well,
Episode 6.
Episode 6. So just real quick, a little bit of housekeeping, just to clarify any confusion that folks might have. As we described in the description of the show, this time we're going to encourage a little bit of focus and attention to the panel and our guests. We've disabled the chat. Please find no disrespect in that, and we encourage you to participate via the email address in the show description, gintellectualsu@gmail.com. And if you would just send your comments, questions for our guests and panel to that address, we will respond and get to as many as we can. But just to clarify, excuse me, that's what's going on for this edition of Guerrilla Intellectual University. So before we move any further, anything either of you want to add or clarify or say before we move on and bring our guest on?
Just that it's a beautiful day for a revolution. We want to salute Bob Marley today on his born date. I know that a good comrade, Dr. Jared Ball, has one of our favorite freedom fighters and comrades behind him today, Mumia Abu Jamal. There's an excellent interview that we'll be tweeting out today on that Mumia actually did with Bob Marley, November of '79, I believe it was. So, it speaks to the work. So definitely shout out. We remember Bob Marley for his cultural work.
Right on. And definitely, please, if you haven't, check out the interview we did with Lynn Washington and Jr. and Todd Stephen Burroughs yesterday with some updates on Mumia and the comparison between him and Tyree Nichols. So anyway, all right. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and get to our guest then. We have a very special guest this morning, Felicia Denaud, who is, among many other things, an assistant professor of Africana studies at the University of Cincinnati. She writes, in the words of Sylvia Wynter, towards the end of empire, war, and accumulation by elimination. That is very dope. Welcome, Felicia, to Guerrilla Intellectual University.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having this program, honestly.
Right on. So I know there's a lot we wanted to get to. You have, you have your own work coming out, and you are also a contributor to this new book that we're going to talk a little bit about this morning, that you're going to be in conversation this morning about In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love by Dr. Joy James. And in your chapter, The Plurality of Abolitionism, you and Devin Springer have a very fascinating conversation with Professor James. So with that little bit of a preamble, I will fall back and let you all get started, and look very much forward to it.
Well, yeah, thanks. I look forward to the collective round as well. I mean, so I always I want to know or tell people how I met Felicia. So Felicia is an amazing organizer, and I met them when they were a graduate student at Brown University. And they organize both on campus, and they also organize in the community. And so the architects of abolitionism, like if you see anything online that's at all related or useful, a lot of that was driven by Felicia. I can call you Felicia, right? That, or Dr. Felicia. A lot of that was driven by Felicia's work and their organizing with grad students. So again, I'm always informed, and you all always kind of push me to think more critically and get up and do more, even when I'm cranky. So thank you for all your intellectual and political contributions.
Thank you. And I guess I'll add that that Carswell State Reading Group, which is how Joy and I connected originally, was stewarded by a colleague of mine, Kristen May, and took on a life of its own in Rhode Island. And basically, we met with formerly incarcerated people, organizers, students, just community members. And Joy was just such a fundamental part of the analysis we were trying to build out of Rhode Island, which is a small state, but over incarcerated like, all the others. And she was integral to giving us this language of war and captivity. And so I had been working on my dissertation at the time that I met Joy on this idea of unnamable war. I feel like in a lot of Black historical monographs, political theory, there's like this attrition that happens when you're trying to name or categorize ideologically the kind of violence we experience. And it always hesitates to name war. And war becomes, if Black people claim the status of warfare, we're trivializing the status. If we claim the status of genocide, we're trivializing the status of genocide. And so this kind of conceptual attrition really fascinated me and set me off to kind of pursue this idea of unnamable war. Like, what kind of war power are we subject to? And Joy, I feel like there's critical military studies, but we don't even exist, solely on that front. So I'm like, critical war studies is this thing that I'm trying to push my work towards. And I would consider Joy like an architect of that branch. I think there are a lot of people that are there, but you do get told that you're exaggerating, or don't make a metaphor out of war, as you write in the collection of essays. And, this kind of hesitance or this skepticism or this, you're inflating, there's a lack of precision, or you're playing into right-wing talking points. And when it's nothing but a status of war. Slavery is a condition of war. Penal captivity is a condition of war. Where our greatest sort of rebellions, the Haitian Revolution, the Civil War, it's war up and down all the way through. But what kind of war power is what I'm after? And what are the dangers in allowing that war capacity to replicate? That's why I love Joy's like processual language. So you talk about leverage, fractionation. There's this movement to it, and I'm really concerned, alarmed by when this thing like has a viral capacity. The war power of last century is not the war power of this century. What we are encountering is the way it can shapeshift, as you say, Joy. It relies on our capacity to rebel. It actually stabilizes, as Joy says, through our capacity to rebel. It learns. Like, if there's an algorithmic nature to how we're allowed to resist, algorithms, the prior step is data to collect. Before you can actually have a proficient algorithm, you need data. And we are that data. So the datafication of our rebellion, all of this fascinates me. And so my dissertation culminates in a chapter about the atomic bomb and how all the uranium was sourced from Katanga in the Congo. And there was a shadow war basically fought in the Congo between the Nazi regime and the United States over this uranium, because it was the most enriched uranium on the planet at that time. And now there are like multiple sources, Canada, Navajo Nation, but this was the determining theater for developing that kind of weaponry and that kind of capacity. And so I tie it to kind of all of the legal regimes that go into managing the Congo. And what fascinates me is that the war power we're subject to, it bounces between a state power and a master power, which to me is like the private right to violence. The Congo, we all know, is like a private holding of Leopold, but there's this wonderful book called Rogue Empires that looks into all the legal loopholes that Europe had to allow to create a privatized state, which is very different than a corporate state. And the author makes this kind of claim. But so what I'm tracing is the war power that we live through is about that shuffling of coercive capacity between the private realm and the public. And so I'm trying to throw up some flags about how the state needs masters. And if we are going to pursue a revolutionary state, we have to leave behind that imprint that the Western state brings with it, which is always, it needs a kind of master power to outsource things it cannot do, to reclaim when master power has been sufficiently produced. And so I don't know, that's kind of, the dissertation is wide, it crawls through time and space, but ultimately what I'm interested in is how do we continue to situate ourselves in a conversation about war? What does that open up in terms of international solidarities, in terms of international claims we can make, and how does it kind of awaken people to the ideological construction of violence? Because even when we ourselves say, oh, this is domestic war, why are we qualifying it with the domestic? Why are we giving war, like war is the conceptual property of the interstate system. And when we qualify things as domestic, we're saying, oh, that's right, war belongs to states, but war happens in states. So I want to kind of, unnamable war is my capacious way of looking at all of the diaspora to think about how private and public violence offload on one another to produce a capacity for war. So it's not just like, we're in a condition of war and like, although you could say that, but it's this condition that we're in builds a war capacity for the West. Western fundamentalism relies on the capacity we endow it to practice war. And so, but it's unique in the sense that it needs that master power. Like the master figure is something I cannot leave behind. There's no way that it doesn't have an afterlife. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, how does the master live on beyond the figure? So this is where joy comes in again as a function. What is that function? And how does it allow moments of instability to be stabilized, like coming out of the Civil War, the progressive era, the post-civil rights era? There's always this interesting, I call it a generative struggle between master and state. That to me is like the secret war power, the subterranean war power that we are actually dealing with. So I went off on a tangent, but that's to say, joy, I think, is this. When I told her about the project, she was like, we need this. And that's the first time I got that response. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's great because it's not only because we were talking on the phone for hours after I met you, right? You're in Providence, I'm in the city. Of course, there's only one city. So in airbrushing revolution for the sake of abolition, the last section is called War is Not a Metaphor. And that language came out of the discussions with you and your collective crew. So, I mean, this is the way I see it. I can't claim any form of thought because it's all collective thinking, right? And so because we were on the phone for hours and I was like, and then when I get off, and I'll say other people too. So not like there's no implication of you in anything that I do, right? That other people find problematic. But it was this critique that was coming from so-called students who were intellectuals, but within the academy, right? As we know, everybody on this platform has taught in different forms of schools. There's this hierarchy and there's this disciplinary, procedure that students are the recipients of knowledge, not the producers of knowledge. And so often we miss the collaboration, right, among ourselves. But so, yeah, I want to thank you because, and also this is what the book is about. Like, I'm just going to hold it up. We're crowdsourcing soon so we can get it into different incarcerated zones, women's prisons, also where men and non-binary people are housed as well. So the war is something, I mean, you say it's unnameable, but also I'm wondering if it's unspeakable. Like you're disciplined not to talk about it. And I think this is where my critique of conventional academics who are liberal or radical liberals or whatever, however they wouldn't identify as such, right? But the being disciplined as if we were also students, like we're pre-K, K, or whatever, to talk about what goes down in the quote household. Like the democracy in the state and society socialize you, I believe, into belonging, as if they're going to give you protections while they're actually predatory. So you mentioned Leopold, right? So to go back, I mean, Belgium, and it's a private ownership of the Congo, which is rare. So it's a different form of colonialism. But the level of terror is off the hook because the master gets to, I mean, what they do with mass rape, mass torture. I mean, when the state does that as a visible flex of power, it makes you realize the state is fascist. And so most states have to pretend that they have coherence and they're not just terror regimes. But for Leopold, if you did not pick your quota of tobacco, rubber, whatever he's selling, right, he would have your hand chopped off. It's so freaking irrational. So after you chop off my right hand, you think I'm going to pick more? This is not about production. It's not even about stable political economies like exploitation of labor. And it sort of goes beyond the standard exploitation of slave, because now you just maimed and tortured the slave. And so they have less productivity, or maybe they'll be dead, within 48 hours because they bleed out or infection. And so I'm wondering if our struggle, and maybe this is the impact that the AP folks are having on me, I'm wondering if our struggle is so embedded in our psyches, right, that we don't want to describe it as a war because we actually know what war looks like. And so we have to pretend that it's a political regime. And that's different from a battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like war formalizes, it creates fronts, it does all of that ideological acceleration that is frightening. I was frightened writing.
Yeah.
That's how alienated you are from touching the experience sometimes, like you said, embedded in your psyche. Because M.A. Césaire says to think dangerously, or to think clearly is to think dangerously. And that's exactly what I felt. You feel when you're starting to veer into that dangerous sort of zone, and when the overwhelming reality of how violence is organized and arrayed against you becomes clear. And that's what unnamable war did to me, but also like the master state complex. Because, I mean, the privatization of violence is accelerating right now. The war actually comes from the private domain. It's when you start raising standing armies that it becomes like the property of the state. And so it has this it's rooted in a kind of private affair, in the ancient regime kind of warfare. But between what's happening in Minnesota with kind of private patrols, the Wagner Group, Blackwater, who renamed themselves, I mean, what I want to do is anticipate the next stage. And what the master state complex does is, however terrifying, it gives me a name or a capacity to track how this mutates. That's what I'm interested in, like the intra-community work. And I think what your piece does so well is that there's this spiritual component that allows you to enter the fear. There's this buoyancy in your writing. There is this kind of, not to say you're pure, but there is this purity of spirit I almost feel that braces you to face it. And what I want to do in similar ways, I draw from literature and film and song and that's why I love how you open, is be able to forecast a little bit, and to be able to stop being on the back foot. And when I started seeing how the master state complex, its sort of reproductive capacity, for example, there were interesting arguments made at the turn of the 20th century that slave owners actually took over what was supposed to be a state mandated regulation of the slave trade. So when the transatlantic slave trade was banned, slave owners did a favor and bailed out the state. And this should be recognized in how like prison and convict leasing and how all of that's going to be played out. And so this argument is made by like a senator at the Southern Sociological Association in like 1911. And I was like, that's it. That's what the unnamable war is. It's not just a matter, like right now we're very concerned in terms of like neoliberal structuring with the privatization of things. But it's also the way publics are made on the backs of Black people. But it's not just publics, it's also privates. And so it's that interdependence that I want to trace. And so my question is, like when I was talking to community organizers in Rhode Island. They were like, okay, we understand the abolition thing, but what happens when then this entire police force is privatized? Like, what are you going to tell us? What are you going to do? We know that's the dimension, right?
But that's kind of key, right? Because in the struggles, it looks like it's a struggle against the state, but I believe it is it's a two-headed hydra. I mean, a hydra had more than one head, so it's probably multiple. But you can't just deal with the state without understanding the privatization of terror and accumulation. And this is our previous conversation. Is this, about oligarchs and corporations running it? Or is it, about the state? Like, what is the state as an autonomous being? From now, it used to be millionaires, now it's a billionaire class that runs it. But even as you were saying about Blackwater, I believe we understudy the mercenaries. Like Eric Prince, who's the brother of Betsy DeVos, who's running like the Department of Education under Trump, which means, they're eviscerating anything that could possibly look like, sovereign, we don't have sovereign rights, but the right to have sovereign rights, like not to try to be snarky, in terms of Black people, Indigenous, people of color, working class, queer, Marxist, like it's just, we're going to disappear you conceptually through indoctrination and education. But what's your brother doing? Like, okay, I have to keep one eye on what you're doing, right? And also the rights of not to be, at least, have more protections against sexual violence or rape on campus and other places. But your brother's, former Navy SEAL, if I recall correctly, I mean, he's got a multi-billion-dollar gig recruiting from the military. So the state wars train what will be private employees who will work for mercenaries. Right. And that revenue stream has never diminished. There's always, as you put, there's a coexistence of the two, right?
And sometimes they clash. That's what's interesting. That's what the Civil War is. It's a competition over federal power. It's not a competition over like, I want to do this here and you can do that there and states right there. It's actually an all-out assault for federal capacity to remake the contract between master and state. And so the Haitian Revolution has a similar thing where you divide the metropole and you divide the colonial elite. You exploit those divisions. So when we are really in our bag, so to speak, in terms of strategy and rebellion, we are always splintering the master state function. And I take function from you, and I wanted to pose that question to you. Like, you were so insistent that captive maternal is not an identity, it's a function. And then you, like you said, you're attuned to fractionation. That's like another word you use to describe sort of people that could conform to an elite caste, but instead break it apart, initiate new kinds of cadres, like Ida B. Wells is your kind of, favorite ancestor, as you say. So it often comes to a point, or like, let's look at Leopold. He was so bad that the European community realized that there was these legal runaways, right? Like this idea of private sovereignty. Again, it's not a private corporation. It's not like a privately held state, it's private sovereignty. And there's this just fascinating legal thing that this guy does to track this phenomenon. Basically what he says, they use this to settle Africa. And the settlement of Africa, to me, is like the biggest demographic like movement. It is parallel to the slave trade, just the white like settlement of Africa. The way it happens, the numbers, the massification, it's incredible. I think it's something we disappear from our imagination, that they were able to settle so effectively so quickly. And it was through some of these legal things. Like, how does Europe rationalize to itself these processes? But the thing that I'm interested in is, how do you, Leopold's so bad that Europe says we need to make this a public colony.
Yeah, but so
from the Belgian Congo.
Leopold's so bad that Mark Twain has to write an op-ed on him.
Right.
And it's just like, because he's like off the hook, but this is the Berlin Conference, right? They're cartographers. They sit down and they redraw the map of the world, meaning the Africa, and they just carve it up. I'll take this part of the, like it's past the level of a real estate developer. Right. I see it as you're right. Like, what happens to us when we're trafficked on this shores? Massive genocide, and a world war, actually, in some ways, right?
Yeah.
But when they have that conference, where it's in Berlin, I don't know where they were meeting, but when they have that conference and we're going to carve up Africa, and Leopold's like, I'm going to take this, that's another form of terror. So even their bureaucracy, right, and their reshaping of the world is all expression of warfare. But I want to go back to what you said about the spirituality that we have, right? So the book opens with a discussion of Oshun, right? I don't know how well people know the Orishas, Elegua. I mean, we could go to the list, right? Yemaya, Oshun, Obatala, Eshu. But it's about Oshun, and this is what I was listening to, our culture, right? Someone was doing a narrative about how Oshun petitions Olodumare, which is the head spirit, because the waters have dried up on earth. And the reason Olodumare allowed the deserts to spread is because the other Orisha were going to pull a coup on them. And they're like, and they wanted Oshun to join in this rebellion. And it wasn't a rebellion for the mass. It was I am not officially in the religion. So my first line is, please forgive me if I err. Excuse me. But what I'm trying to do is express aspects of our culture, which I learned, in the South Bronx from, gifted teachers. They just weren't academic teachers, right? They were madrinas, there were other folks, but they kept community together and they kept intellect and spirit alive. So Oshun is like, I'm not doing this rebel coup thing. I'm not trying to accumulate, but I'm going to fly. And Oshun's known for their beauty, right? And then they're based in water. But I'm going to fly through towards the sun to reach Olodumare. So what happens? Their feathers become singed. They become scorched. They're half, dead or desiccated. They have the appearance of an ashen gray vulture, but they petition for the return of waters. And it's that love. And this is why the title of the book, In Pursuit of Revolutionary Love. It's that flight towards our capacity to care. And right, I talk about the captive maternal as a function, but to care in ways that the captor cannot reach us in terms of our psyche and our spirituality, so that we can replenish, so that we can fight again. I mean, once they control your psyche, and I think I've been reading Michael Sawyer's book on Malcolm, and he talks a lot about Malcolm saying Black thinking. And there's a quote he has from Malcolm where it's our consciousness that we need to shift, which we all know, right? In order to prepare for these types of engagements. And I don't think it's, at least for me, I can't do it without some form of spiritual guidance. And it's not enough, whatever I learned in seminary or Catholic school. I mean, yeah, and whatever, that was useful. But it's not what allows me to face a war, right? And so for me, and maybe we could talk about this more. I mean, what does love mean to you? Or, I mean, you make a really important contribution to the book, as does Devin, right? And there is this point when you're talking with me and you're asking questions, and I say something like, you can't dance with the devil and come back with 2 feet. But then I do say, I do see do. I mean, because I'm in the academy and it's an elite sector and whatever. But how does love discipline? And how does it revive us?
Yeah. I feel like there are like multiple planes of struggle. And the highest plane, to maybe pull from Cabral, is like it's been interrupted, it's been diverted, which is, you say that revolutionary love is about sentience, not science. And I really sat with that, because a lot of my work is interested in consciousness, and not just like consciousness, like, oh, I'm aware of things, but this experience of self-awareness, but also like a we referent, that endowment, that singular evolutionary like miracle. And all of this diverts us all of this is all this, you know, this desertification of being, like this dryness, this arid, you know, to pull on Fanon, this diverts us from the larger truths that our, you know, systems were after. That struggle for relation, that struggle for language, that struggle for feeling, to name feeling, to become feeling, you know, to dance into something, to dance into an ethic, to sing into, all of that has been diverted. There's a higher order task to me, that it could be called spirit, it could be ushered under a number of like labels, that all of this arrests and compromises. And we're being led to, we're in the ecocide death spiral at this point, you know, and now they're overriding everything they've done through ecology now. Ecology becomes like, now I'm Haitian, so Haiti becomes ecological disaster as opposed to political manipulation, interference, and all the rest. Ecology is crowding out any other kind of claim when we all know they're deeply implicated. But so my spirit exists at that higher order, to access beauty, to push language, to push human capacity, to find out new ways of being in a community. All of that is lost, but we have to fight this front. But underneath, and I never let myself drift too far from the fact that I'm a living being. I come out of a moment, like a miraculous moment of creation that can never be served by the knowledge or the resources that the world we have currently provides. And that's what I'm after. Like, what would it truly be like to write, not just towards the end of empire, which is my earthly task, but to write towards a higher evolutionary thing? I mean, they've totally arrested human development. And that's the tragic thing. But in these pockets, the maroon zones that you like to talk about, there is a vitalism. There are seedlings in what we make. There's beauty, there's pulse, there's a vitalism, there's pure life in pockets and places, but there's so much despair. And so I try to order my tasks in that way, to never stray too far from that, like cosmic, right? Like, what does Fanon say? That man is a cosmic yes. I mean, I don't think anyone understood as like angry, like, you know, some of his comrades would just say like Fanon was scary, like when he was in conferences with people, just like stern and like too truthful maybe, but there's this underlying yes to life that I will never let go of. I will never compromise, but it becomes a matter of ordering them, aligning them, and learning the great, and this is why that piece I wrote recently is about learning. Hey, people often say Haiti is punished for the revolution, and I don't like that. Haiti is punished because we just disappeared the 1800s totally when we say that. Haiti is punished because it created institutionally mechanisms to refuse the accrual of capital on the world order's terms. That's why it's punished, because it actually put in the institutional mechanisms between the rural and the urban elite, between nation and state, between however we want to conceptualize bossal, which in Haiti is like a derisive term for somebody that's kind of like, you know, from the countryside, but originally it meant somebody that was born in Africa and enslaved in the New World. Right, but it's still a term of derision when you kind of throw it around. But the bossal, like that, the bossal created networks, institutions, and ideological mechanisms to refuse accumulation on certain terms. That's why Haiti's punished. That's why you see, you know, we kind of skip to the debt. We rely on the debt to kind of have this explanatory power. All of that is true and important, but we don't pay attention to what was built as like barriers. And this comes with its own problems, because like Jean Casimir, one of our best theorists, is like, then you can never actually strike at the center. You're striking in your own kind of, and it becomes this internal kind of mess. But we have the resources. We've done it, but it's been severely punished. And I'm talking about absolute hunger. I'm talking about levels of exposure to trafficking, to the world's detritus. I mean, dumping fake rice on hungry people. You know, international assassins wiping out your president without a murmur from the world. So there's a level. There's a level of punishment, but like, yeah. So my spirit is nourished by the fact that there's a higher order task.
Okay,
and
but
yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I want to ask you more about that, but there's a couple of things came up, right? So when you were going through the list of torture and terror, right? Also, I was thinking of UN peacekeepers coming and raping, women and girls and leaving on babies behind, right? And having no accountability against their violence or need to support the children, that they're fathering and creating. I'm wondering, well, okay, in the book, it begins with Deshaun Harrison, right, who won the Lambda Literary Award for their previous book. The forward is from Deshaun. The afterword is from Mumia, and they're great contributions.
Beautiful.
Mumia talks a lot about life in the spirit, the Orisha, and Harriet Tubman is their preferred captive maternal. Well, mine is maybe Teal Mobley, but respect to all. Deshaun, Deshaun talks, Deshaun talks a lot about death. So you're emphasizing life, which obviously, we gravitate toward, it's magnetic. What is the balance? How do you see, for me, a lot of the visuals is on the seesaw. So the captive maternal is the fulcrum, right there. And that's how we, go back and forth, the leveraging, stabilizing, et cetera. But the captivity from the state is it takes our generative powers and then it uses it to, strengthen state, corporation, master state. How do you see death, though? Because it seems to me our proximity to death has to be assimilated into our love or reconciled with the way we love, or we just fear death. And so we obey, we don't, and the rebellion could just be intellectual, right? Or spiritual, but we fear or hate the African religions, right? As being primitive or not, whatever, that we fear or hate all Black militant formations because it becomes like, as you said, the autonomous zones that the Haitians were able to create. We look down on certain things related to Africa, right? So how do you balance the death and incorporate it into the love and fear so that you can actually cope with the stressors of always being threatened by some form of death, loss of job, loss of prestige, loss of your kids through foster care, loss of kin through imprisonment. Actually, Max Parthas is going to talk about the 13th Amendment, it's slavery abolition, not prison abolition next week. So that's kind of like when I'm listening and I'm agreeing, but I'm wondering if our pursuit of love is trying to push away death rather than to come to terms with it.
Yeah, no, I had that on my my list of questions for you. Like, what does agape, you kind of pair agape and political will. And my question was like, why now? What does it what need are you serving and providing that language of agape? And does it have to do with kind of the pervasive death dealing or the premature death? Or I guess I would say one part of my dissertation looks at pregnant enslaved rebels. So like insurgencies led by pregnant slaves. And I mean, there's not a huge archive for that. But I wanted to understand how you can live in a death function or a war function that actually needs you to regenerate yourself. And so it has a natal, it's a death drive with a natal dimension. And there's this like literary theorist, I think his name is Cassidy Pinkin, who does this interesting analysis of the oceanic, what he calls the oceanic division of like reproductive labor. And essentially he's saying that like it's the capacity to regenerate, well, this is the language I give to what he kind of identifies, is to regenerate what you've killed. That is unique to that new world slavery. That you can maim, you can eliminate, you can have these 7-year, lifespans, but you can also instantaneously regenerate labor and life. Of course, all of that labor and reproductive power comes out of Africa, and it's centuries long. They're capitalizing on century-long reproductive labor on the continent, but it's that ability to instantaneously regenerate. And it gives Blackness a regenerative capacity. So I guess this is to say, like, life and death might name the same thing. And that is also pulling on my voodoo roots, where perhaps I don't see them as so antithetical. Perhaps you can name the same thing either with saying death or with life. I don't know. And then you can't run away from the death function of war. So I think in centralizing war, I'm trying to centralize. I mean, Africa is the youngest continent. I mean, it has the youngest, and it's a population, and I'm like, what will they do with us? Vital, young, and and becoming the newest theater of global warfare, where the war on terror is being pulled down, and Africa is going to be the beating heart of a return to hard geopolitics, in my opinion. I think with Ukraine and what's happening now, we're going back to the good old power politics, but with whole new technological capacity. But Africa is going to be the beating heart where these things are settled. So war for me is centering. Think about that being not aging. I mean, we're used to this. We know this. And you said Jonathan comes back to you. That's how you know, like, there's like a capacity for resurrection, because he's with you. And like, you're like, I can't speak for anybody else, but he remains. There's something spiritual about that for me. So I guess this is all to say that, like, I hope the war, like focusing on the mechanisms of war, centers how important elimination and death are to contemporary politics, all politics, but also that we sit differently. We sit differently in that. Like they needed us to regenerate ourselves, especially the US, which becomes a domestic, the population actually reproduces itself in large numbers, whereas in the Caribbean and parts of Latin America, it's the traffic that does the reproductive work. So I wanted to sit with that, with like, what kind of war is a natal war? Most are processes of incapacitation, elimination, containment. They need you to make yourself. How does that natal thing carry on, and how might it shape how we think about life, how we think about this regenerative power that they think we have? Like, there's this other element that I always found fascinating. Like on slave ships, if the slave got stuck in the Atlantic, they'd be like, okay, which one of you is controlling the weather? Before science, the seams of science really close in on, and they would whip people, they would tie them to the mast, there are all sorts of interesting stories in the archive about punishing captives because they're stopping the tides, they're stopping the wind. So this endowment of like a regenerative thing, it starts in the kind of theological thinking, but it filters all the way down to how they manage us in a secular way. And so I focus on life because our capacity for life is just so central to how all of this functions, but never without acknowledging that war is death. And that's why
So what I was saying when you mentioned Jonathan, I think people know you mean Jonathan Jackson.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, there's a chapter in the book where Rebecca Ann Wilcox.
Yeah, that is my favorite conversation of
that lasted a really long time, but we're arguing back and forth. And my respect to Rebecca, because they're arguing with me and saying that I'm not clear enough right?
Mm-hmm.
And also they're at Princeton Seminary. So then it's part of the political theology network. So again, I was in seminary, but I left early, and that's what I said. I mean, I went what I said. I was seeking the gifts of God, and I found it to be, a business or a store. And I was like, I can do other things with my time, and I left, right? But I was trained by some prominent, like, liberation theologians, Black theologians, right? So I learned some things. But the thing about Jonathan, to go back to the merger of life and death, I mean, I remember this 17-year-old who I never met because of an act of love that was encircled by death, right? So the California prisons, if I recall correctly, had a law that there will be no escapes under any conditions, and we don't care who you shoot and kill. It's just like our
Right.
manifestation of power is now nobody walks out of here without like a piece of paper that we signed onto. So he's in the van. Of course, he's using Davis's guns, and so that's how they get involved. But they have nothing to do with planning, which is why they're exonerated. Also, it helps to have 6 attorneys and a lot of backing international, right? Because as we know, it's not enough to be innocent to not be incarcerated. You have to have resources. But he's in the van with 3 incarcerated men, including Rochelle McGee, who we always say on this platform is 83, still in prison. People need to think, we collectively, individually, how we can contribute to bringing him out. But the state kills the white judge, makes the white DA paraplegic, shoots and wounds a white juror, kills 2 of the men, Christmas and McLean, and then shoots and maims Rochelle McGee, who survives, right, to be a co-defendant until their cases, Davis and McGee's cases, are severed. And of course, shoots and kills Jonathan. So for me, that stunning array of the master and the state, I mean, this is when, the plantation owner is like, I'm just going to drown like 8 of you to make an example to the 800 of you. So you remember when I say, work for 14 hours under the lash, you'll remember these dead bodies, right? And for me, I said to Rebecca, it's a haunting, but it's not a haunting that scares me, even though it's horrific. So this is my question really is, and I'm repetitive, but I'm trying to learn. How is it that we deal with death and terror? And if there's anything that we could structure in our consciousness or in our teachings with each other, collective teachings, that would amplify our capacity. And Janine Jones, the philosopher, talks a lot about capacity, right? And I know you two have spoken, that our capacity for handling terror and intimidation, we could go from Tyree to whoever is going to be shot next week, or trafficked, right? Or, bombed through, drone strike through AFRICOM. How is it that comes to our consciousness and doesn't just settle in our nervous system?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I honestly have no answer. I find fortification, I think I have a line in that recent piece that's like, political abandonment is like a strategy of containment. To say, like, when we forget, disappear, repress, or simply just don't have the time for people that were devotional.
Yeah, the devoted.
The devoted. Like, I have to be honest here. Am I among the devoted? Probably not. Right. Like, when I isolate that devotion, I'm talking about very particular people. Like in the piece, it's like Bukhari and Maurice Bishop, and it's 2 people I'm trying to think with lately. But there's a reverence that you have for people that have been pilfered from, because no one can do it as good as them. Like when you write about Foucault and George Jackson, they're pilfered from, they're mocked, they're people were afraid of them.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do for me is you build a capacity to remain devoted to their devotion. And that like, I don't know, a friend was talking to me about how, like, when you have something stressful, and you don't complete the cycle of the stress, it lives in your nervous system, as you said. So what does it mean to complete the cycle of like a stressful cycle? And I return to your kinds of writing, because you're unflinching in your ability to elevate and defer. That humility to defer to those that walk the walk. And this is not a deference. Like, I know there's that new great book, Elite Capture, that really, Olufemi Tayo, who talks about how, identity politics creates these like mechanisms of deference that they're not helpful. All of a sudden you're an expert because you're just sitting there and you're this or that. But there's another kind of deference, and it's the deference to the devoted. It requires humility. It requires self-awareness. So that's all to say, to me, when I feel, I said to my husband, I'm like, we look cowardly, and I feel cowardly in sitting here watching another execution. I feel embarrassed. I feel, you feel small. So returning to those who, I don't know, ate the fear. Like, I talk to my students a lot about how fear is fundamental to our political life. And so I don't think there are any answers, but how do we work through fear? What are the things that actually allow us to work through fear? What are the things that actually give us clarity? To me, it's this very deep but spiritual deference that people like you and others, my advisor, Anthony Bogue, there's so many people that you won't be disciplined out of, celebrating who really, threw down, as you like to say. And I think just that calisthenic of exercising that deference and thinking about devotion and challenging us to think about what devotion may look like, that gets me going. I really don't know. I think we're in the post-BLM era now. I think BLM has exhausted as like a framework that really did move people, in whatever direction is like questionable, but its capacity to gather people, I think to absorb and redistribute energy is like, it's done. I think that we're into a new kind of phase of whatever this popular conversation will be. I think we might begin to call it the post-BLM era or something like that. And so I think reintroducing these names, like in your piece with Holder, you talk about how you root Black studies in the prison tradition. There are so many different accounts of Black studies. That is one like I have never encountered. And yeah, so I guess this is all to say, I think we can only fortify. And I think you can only complete cycles of like these trauma cycles through deeper and deep conversation about deeper and deeper devotion. And I know that gets into like a weird spiritual language again, but I bring up the spirit of your text because I think that's what's needed. I mean, this is such a crippling and demoralizing and like discursively empty. It's so empty. It's so empty.
But it's a sterile environment in terms, it's very sterile. But and I know like Kalonji and Jared have a lot to say, but I want to just sort of end on this part, right? So when you were speaking, it reminded me of Georgia Bia Jackson, George Jackson's mother, and what she said in a small interview somewhere after, both sons are murdered by the state. Totally unnecessary. Like if you're surrounding a van, just shoot out the tires. Nobody's going to drive anywhere, right? Or, if George says the prison guards are going to kill me and he shares that with his younger brother, and the younger brother becomes a catalyst for devotion, like a love not just to the personal family member, but the love to the concept of Black freedom, or at least if we're not going to be free, we won't be your slave, right? So Georgia Bia Jackson says, like, after they're both murdered by the state, and I'm assuming these are Black people because I don't think she cares about white strangers, when they see her coming, they cross the sidewalk. right? So they're in some places where I've talked about crossing the sidewalk, like I'm just gonna like go over, like, because we don't want to bump into each other. But they literally don't want to recognize her as devotional. They want to shame her for having, like, you had these black boys and you couldn't
Those
control.
sons, yeah.
Like, weren't they supposed to like get a 9-to-5 job, or like, you know, it's like, no, they wanted to be free. Oh, you had free black boys. Oh no, that's like too much, right? And so, I mean, I'm going back because this is what I'm grappling with as well. We all are, right? Because everybody here, you know, helps to raise people or support. On one level, the fear tells you to discipline. This is the captive maternal stages. Like those early stages, we're going to discipline you. We need to lock you down so you don't rebel, so you exist, you know, you can make it out of childhood. Well, you know, Tyree was like 29, whatever he made it out to, and not rebelling, working for UPS as a driver, whatever, you know, skateboarding. It's irrelevant really on certain levels. But I do agree when I look at Rochelle or I look at Mumia, that I do feel, I don't want to say an obligation as a political thing, but there is this sense of that I should be recognizing the people who sacrificed everything as an expression of devotion to us and to freedom. Or even if it wasn't a devotion of love, it was a devotion to end the war by fighting in the war, right? However you want to define that. But I'm just going to be honest, I'm there's so much emotional or psychological or devotional or, you know, spiritual content moving around. I'm not quite sure how to organize it. But I do appreciate the term of devotion because like I say, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not even good at devotional anything, like from prayer. I mean, it's just hit and miss, depends on the day with me. But there is something that drives us even to, you know, be here at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, that we're devoted to something. I just wish we had a more public language to that, so that when the funders come to flood and direct with their hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, whatever, our movements, we can understand from the side of devotion that we can say no to the money, or we can say no to the co-optation, or we can say no to whatever. Or if we take the money, you know, which is fine because it's a resource, we'll direct it back into communities, but never try to leverage ourselves above community.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on with, when something becomes ubiquitous, we got to be like, okay, what is it serving? What is it containing? I think what I want to do is study what triggers people into that level of devotion, like a really systematic study with whatever resources we have at our disposal. Like how do people step into that? And so that's one project I have. And then another is the other side of it, which is schism. How have schisms internally played out fractured movements, and like what can we learn from that pattern of, because you know, schisms are natural to any kind of like political analysis. Factions are going to be created, but there have been some fatal schisms, obviously stoked by the state, but like Bukhari says, fratricidal elements within, you know, you're in the surround, as like Josh Meyer says in Fred Moten. But like, I want to study, how do we better have a handle on what gets people to that degree of commitment, analysis, spirit, like whatever it is, and what would that offer us? We can just slow down and think about like, how does that conversion actually happen? So that's one thing I have. And then also, once we get that converted, how does schism like shake out? Why? And how can we kind of guard against certain things? So those are like my two projects. But all I can commit to right now is like, okay, who are these people? Why? Like what brought them? You know, I'll do like an epigraph to one of my chapters is from George Jackson. He says, both Huey and Jonathan are understandably calling for the program revolution to take into account the fact of racial genocide. Jonathan is calling from his grave, adding another voice to the many thunderous graveyard affirmations, which for us Blacks speeds the revolution to its ultimate issue. And so the chapter is named Graveyard Affirmations from the Household of Imperial Democracy. And that idea of the graveyard affirmation is what compelled like my thing about devotion and wanting to study this. But study is like insufficient. George says at one point, you put down the books and, but that conversion, it's something I want to stoke in myself and others. And so that's all I can do with how things are aligned right now. But I think it's up for grabs, and like a whole program of action can't rest or be couched in words. Like unnamable war will never supplant, feeding people, solving hunger, restoring psyches, creating the symbolic resource. It can't do that. But I'm hoping to identify the things that have gotten people there and to offer that back. Because that's what's within my capacity. And I'm trying to have no illusions about how effective I am. Because that's part of the problem, I think, too, is when you have illusions about what you can do as an individual or even as a collective. Not to say don't dream big and don't, but listening to the graveyard affirmations is my guiding light in a period of, we're just in a period of total transition. Like, I really don't think the techniques of the 20th century, I think there are certain things that are enduring about rebellion and enduring about political processes, but I do think there's a major break. And I know like academics, thinkers don't like, continuity, everything, but I think there's a major break afoot. I think the screen, the way like social life is organized, the way feeling is ciphered into pixels, like all of this is different. I will rest on that. And I think there is a need. There's an openness to all this that is like terrifying and also really like, okay, maybe we could do something different. And that's why I think becoming part of like a anti-war global thing is how I envision my next movement. Like you had this conversation with the Kurdish theorist, and like, she's considered a terrorist by the state of Turkey, Nazan Ustendag. And both of you like were really, I wrote about this in my dissertation, vibing on how the concept of war brings all of you together. And she has this quote of like, when we forsake the humanitarian shelter of conversations on violence, when you let go of the humanitarian shelter of what you're allowed to say about violence, and then you prioritize war, then all of a sudden you have a different global alliance. You're bringing in different people. And the Kurds have such a fascinating, to me, a parallel experience in some ways. It's an experience we can learn from. And the fact that both of you were so moved by each other's analyses of war brought me to this idea of like abolition war. And so like, that's something I try to spend some time thinking about. Like we have a history of abolition wars, what would be the future of abolition wars and whatever else. But I mean, that's all to say, the graveyard affirmations and really being clear about what stands in front of us. Just I think there's a break. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I promise I will stop after this. But for me, it's so great to see you and to be in conversation. Yeah, and the Kurdish women also talk about democratizing violence. Right. Because they have units. I believe they're Muslim, right? So they're all Kurdish women fighting units. But they also talked about the internal contradictions, which maybe as, other people come in the conversation, we can talk about it. And like, I'm like, I don't know who I'm supposed to talking to according to the State Department, but whatever.
Right.
So, like, one of the things, so thanks for bringing that up, Felicia.
No, it's a phenomenal conversation.
No, I'm being snarky. That's a joke. Like, like I was trying to be low key undercover, but like nobody ever heard that podcast discussion. But anyway, so one of the things that they talk about is the violence inside the community. Yeah. Because people are dysregulated, they're hyper, they're violent, they're whatever the thing is, they think women and girls are prey. And they said the first thing we do is we sit down, we have like a roundtable discussion, and we explain to you, like, there will be no rape and there will be no domestic violence against your female partner. And I guess we'll deal with the psychological, emotional, right? But we're focusing on the physical, but we're called all registered. We understand you guys are under stress, like we're being hunted and killed, but you can't do blowback on us. And we will have that discussion. And then if it keeps going on, they're like, okay, we'll have a second discussion, which we will remind you of the first discussion. And then the third thing is like, okay, democratize violence, which means we're trained just like you are. And so if you keep this up, we will treat you as we will use violence against your violence. It's not going to be therapy. We already had 2 meetings with you. If you're going to keep beating your wife or you're going to be raping somebody, then we explained to you to stop. We offered you support to stop. You refused to stop. So now this is another war on war. And I was like, okay, I mean, for me, that it made sense, but I don't know, because the theoretical verbal stuff going on now, right? Like Rebecca's telling me that everybody's using my work, right? In masculinist studies, certain kind of feminist studies. And I was thinking when I was talking to Mamadou Tal and Khadisha Diskin, you have to meet them. I mean, it's virtual. They're in UK, right? So we were talking over the weekend. They're also in the book In Pursuit of Revolutionary War. But they were saying all these folks are using the captive maternal and they're interpreting in different ways. So now it looks like you hate Black feminism, and so this, so the masculinists are using it in other ways, and then the feminists are like, I don't know exactly what they're saying, but anyway, people are saying different things. And since I'm not on social media, I don't want to know what anybody's saying, and so like keep it to yourselves, right? But there does seem to be a way in which internally we have allowed things to become blurry or sloppy in terms of gender conflict. And some people would call it antagonism. So our ability to unify, to deal with the wars, the predatory wars from the master and the state, that capacity is diminished unless we can, I'm not saying do it like the Kurdish women were doing it. Or, I don't know, maybe do it, I don't figure it out. But we don't seem to have a strategy for reconciliation. And so what I ended up saying a couple of days ago, I guess it's going to air this week or something, I was saying these wars, internal wars, some of them are starting to look like brands, right? Because it's like, here's my body of thought and I'm going to sell it. And so the devotion for me isn't there because there's nothing higher to discipline it. Like, even if I never met Rochelle or I only wrote him a few times, I should have written more. Like, I'm always failing. So it almost feels like faith. Like you're never meeting, few people are going to do what Oshun does, fly into the heat in order to bring back resources. And I feel this is what our political prisoners and our rebels did. So when you say about natality, the ability to generate, I think of Assata getting pregnant while she's on trial. And then, then in order to see her daughter, you're like, okay, I need to leave prison now. And then people do things, they sacrifice, people get incarcerated. Silvia Berardini has her incredible interview with Kalonji Janga. But anyway, I hope I'm not sounding like I'm all over the place, and maybe I am. But I'm wondering if we have to take care of some internal business while we're facing, right, the master state alliance to consume us as edibles and then spit us out. And I'm not sure how we balance those tasks. I mean, we're going to start reading George in a couple of weeks, Blood in My Eye. We've divided into 4 sections over 4 weeks. I said the 13th is Max Parthas. On the 20th, who's coming? Kalanji or Jared?
Zach Kondo.
Yes, sorry.
Zach Kondo. Malcolm, it's the day before Malcolm's assassination. Malcolm is assassinated. Kalanji and Jared have put on the table. Again, this is all collective thinking, is just coming out of my mouth. Malcolm's assassinated, George is assassinated, Jonathan's assassinated. We have to deal with our devotion to their memory, their intent, their spirituality. but at the same time, we have these internal contradictions of competition, of co-optation. You know, even what does George mean when now he's marketable to mainstream readers? That was, you know, I mean, because I was at Brown, and I've said before why I left, right? It's because, you know, inviting, you know, BLA or, you know, RNA, Sophia Bakar, like the rebels come to campus. And again, 20 years ago, that's like forbidden and people freak out. 20 years later, I mean, that's a quote, cool thing. And so now they're appearing, and how is memory enough is not a form of devotion if their memory is now compatible to liberal consumption. So now they're popularized, and then I feel like a jerk if I point that, like, why are you talking about them? It's like, one, you don't own them. And it's like, that's real. And two, your interpretation of them isn't even going to be that important, because once they become part of the marketplace of ideas, capital will interpret them as well. And I don't think there'll ever be a George Jackson Day like there's an MLK national holiday, but there's going to be some variation of, well, whatever he was saying, like Ida B. Wells, they completely reinvented Ida B. Wells, right? Or Harriet Tubman's statue in the quad of the CIA, which we talked about in a previous episode. Their ability to capture our spirit of devotion worries me as much as their ability to shoot us down in the street.
And can I just throw in there quickly, isn't that what you two talk about in terms of your definition of abolitionism also? What's happening to all of these things? Or did I mishear?
Felicia?
Yeah, I mean, I posed that question to you in the interview, which is like, do you hold the line? Do you add all of these qualifiers? And I think at some point you're like, I'm not interested in doing like language games, you know, and I think it becomes about the ideas. Like the market like it attaches to personality, ideas, but personality. But when you take George Jackson's words and you spin them into a contemporary analysis of war, or like what he calls the fact of racial genocide, which very few people would affirm, that there is a fact of racial genocide, or that the category of genocide itself relies on conceptual repressions, that it is actually coherent only insofar as it denies the function of genocide that preceded it. Or it'll be spinned on you. Like whenever Haiti comes up online, people are like, oh, well, Dessalines committed genocide, like he's bad. And I'm like, genocide wasn't a category in 1804. Like it'll be spun back, you know. So it's, to me, it's about not letting the ideas remain self-contained, but ushering them forward in a way that retains their edge, that makes them unusable if you're not willing to go to the fact of racial genocide. Do you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah,
That's one like market buffer that I find you'll find people quoting specific things. You'll find a particular kind of engagement with like many thinkers, like even, you know, like, yeah, well, I mean, not get into people, but we're good at parsing and amplifying, and then that amplification does a whole other work of containment. But there are other components of these thinkers that are simply cannot be assimilated. They just can't. They're just it's too unruly, it's too aggressive, it's too. So I'm always like looking for those components, but doing my work, which is moving the paradigm forward. And that's what I hope I got this thing from listening to reading what people were saying in the 60s and 70s, you know. So this is not like, oh, I came up in but reanimating something that, for example, I think Foucault in the Academy is a good metric for how this goes. He's writing about war and then he kind of shifts to governmentality. And you kind of told me that paralleled just the end of conversations about war as a category in intellectual communities in the early 90s. kind of just gets disappeared, and it becomes governmentality or all these other ways of like talking about management.
But yeah, because it becomes, I mean, sorry to jump in, but it's like the mask assassination of George Jackson, right? So Jean Genet is trying to get Foucault interested in George's case before he's murdered. And then they produced this pamphlet. And actually, I wrote this piece, which nobody will publish last 3-4 years. But it was like, okay, I have a critique of Foucault here, right? How you use this Black revolutionary, masculinity, I'm putting in quotes because I'm not sure where masculinity and femininity stop and start, right? So I'm not, these are constructs for me, and some of them mostly are performative. But it is almost as if they usurp the energy and the knowledge and the guerrilla intellectualism and rebellion of George to put in this pamphlet. And of course they're outraged, this is after he's killed, and so they'll call it an assassination. And because these French intellectuals are calling it that, then Americans who are Europhiles are like, oh, maybe we should pay attention. But there's a way in which I feel like they reduce George into an edible, like is it Vincent Woodard, the Delectable Negro, like the Black queer theorist who died, a number of years ago, and his colleagues, I don't know if their colleagues, constructed the book, but they're talking about the enslavement era where we're not just racialized, we're sexualized in a particular queer way, right? And then we're reduced to edible consumption. Like the whole point is that we're desired on all these metrics. And again, this is why I think AP sometimes is very important to think about, because they're talking about psychological desire, phobias about Blackness, but then you're attracted to.
Yeah.
Or then why are your hands always up in black hair? It's just like, that's natural and stuff. Like, why are you yanking on somebody's dreadlocks as a white girl? When there's a brother standing in front of you just trying to go through a queue, right? And you point this out to a Black cop and you go, well, can I yank her hair? The blonde's hair? And they're like, oh no, that's forbidden. But yeah, she yanked your hair. Well, that happens, right? So there's, George becomes an edible, right? And when that happens, it's almost like you would have to, can you even retrieve George from academic elites? And Foucault also visited Attica. And as my students, when I was teaching at Brown, pointed out, and it was a Black sister, wait, you had us read this stuff? And again, I need to go back and read the literature again. Perhaps I'm in error, might be. But let's just say, what's the possibility that Foucault toured Attica and just looked at the bloodstains and, the what was left of carnage in this empty building and talked about architecture, not about the murdered rebels. And that's, this is the shift. And I don't know that we can even, what is fidelity then to the rebel? What is fidelity, which is a form of devotion to the revolutionary, which then becomes fidelity, devotion to the rebellion itself? And when we're tampering with content, it's almost like selling you a plastic Jesus or something, right? Like to stick in your car, or the cross. The signifier doesn't represent the struggle, the loss, and the redemption through sacrificial love. And I'm not sure we can not lock that down. Sorry, go ahead, Kalanji.
No, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but no, I mean, I think that, to answer your question, we can absolutely retrieve,
right?
You know what I'm saying? Our liberators. It has to be coupe tete boule kai, right? We have to, we have to take it there. And I think the thing is, we sit on the sideline and we watch these characters commodify our freedom fighters and our ancestors and this ancestral treason. And we are guilty as well when we sit back and we allow George to be commodified. We're guilty as well when we allow the CIA to put up a statue of Harriet Tubman. But the thing is, these academics, they're approachable. They're like the local politicians. We have to deal with them like we're supposed to. You know, the position has to be, when we talk about from a spiritual aspect, while we're praying for our advancement and our survival, we should pray that the spirit of George Jackson comes and deal with them. Because I think that the thing is, they tamper, that word that you use, they tamper with some things that they shouldn't be tampering with, you know. So the thing is, until we decide that we are serious about our own liberation, they will continue to play with our liberation. They will continue to put Malcolm on a stamp. They will continue to talk about doing some faulty movie about George. But we have to deal with these folks accordingly. And the way we combat it, first and foremost, is when we're on these platforms like we're on now, we have to bring out the raw grit of what these freedom fighters are talking about. The problem is, we dance, but we're not trying to dance like George. We dance, but we're not trying to be Jonathan. So it begs the question of, when we talk about war, what is war without retribution and a redistribution of pain? If war is only us being massacred, then we're not at war. We're in a war. And I think that we have to be clear as we talk about these terms, because we will confuse ourselves into believing that we're fighting when we're not doing jack diddly squat. We're sitting back, playing the role and being victimized. You understand what I'm saying? But as our comrade Deruba pointed out, a revolutionary is not a victim. And we can't continue to play the role of the victim. So I have a real problem with sitting back allowing, I don't care about how many books you wrote, what your press is, I'll rip your book up in front of you. And we will denounce it because of the fact that you are disrespecting our ancestors. That's how I'm looking at it. When you violate our political prisoners and you try to make a check off of our political prisoners, you deserve to be checked. Because like we talk about Rochelle McGee, indeed, it's been 60 years, that's 6 decades. 6 decades that he's been in these gulags. And you have these folks who walk around and they parade around these different campuses. They make a whole lot of money for touring and saying his name and all that type of stuff. That has to stop. And we have to be clear about what our struggle is about. You can't just come with all these different nuances. You can't just throw a spin on it. Black August has nothing to do with a party. Black August has nothing to do with certain events or freedom fighters. It is about political prisoners, and we have to be clear. It's about our folks who were martyred. It was about our folks who were kidnapped. And when we talk about George, we got to talk about George like George talks. Not like what these French writers are talking about. Not like what the Boston Globe is talking about. Not like what Angela Davis is talking about. We got to talk about George like George is talking. And if we're afraid to do so, then we should shut up too. We should shut up as well, because we're doing a disservice. We can't keep playing games. Damn right, name their names. I'm sorry. It is very personal when it comes to our ancestors. If it was your mother, if it was your child, you wouldn't sit back and allow someone to talk reckless about your child or your mother when you know the truth. You wouldn't sit back and allow anyone to make money or make a career off of your loved one. So if you love revolution and you love freedom fighting and you love George Jackson, then you should love approaching these folks in whatever way, by any means necessary, as they would say, right? So this is how I look at it. I know that you all talked about the whole piece on devotion. I think that when we talk about our liberation movement, spirit moves us in different ways, right? I can't write, I can't think, or I can't talk about certain freedom fighters without a spirit of devotion. You understand what I'm saying? Because I recognize that, you know, in my tradition, you know, we come, you know, as they say, energy never dies. So our spirit never dies. So I'm a believer in the fact, I'm a believer in our spirit existing and it transferring into different situations. And that even goes out to the folks who are on the street, the so-called street organizations. A lot of these folks are warriors who haven't gotten their proper information just yet. You understand what I'm saying? But what happens is a lot of these quote unquote academics, a lot of these folks who are grassroots and nonprofit, again, they commodify the situation. So they don't want to touch certain things. They don't want certain people on the same set as them because of the fact that the wool will be pulled off. So now they see that, okay, you're not really Asada's daughter.
Hmm.
You're not. You're not blood in my eye. You don't have any blood in your eye. You understand what I'm saying? You're not a gorilla. You know, you're not a new panther or old panther or whatever that is. That's not you. And we don't have to necessarily just go on a rampage attacking folks, but we have to. I was taught from my OGs that we have to correct the wrong on the spot. We can't just let it go. I can't let Joy James is cool, that's my comrade or whatever, so I can just let her say whatever she want to say. It don't go like that. No, because of the fact that this is when we have to separate the individual from the movement. And if we're not a part of a movement, then we're cannon fodder.
That's key. That's key. Like my advisor said to me, he sees when I was a first year in grad school, like my mind is split between the street and the classroom. And he's going to do his best to help me like reconcile that. And there's a difference between theorizing from a formation and then what I'm doing, which is like you're writing a book, you're trying to provide reason, but there's two different urgencies. You produce different things. It produces different levels of relevance. And I learn from everything and anyone, but I that is so key. Who is actually theorizing from a collective body of like that's committed to action versus sitting at your desk, which is what I'm up to right now. I just moved here. I'm not part of anything. I haven't been part of anything in a while. I'm still trying to figure out terrain. What is there? You know, that is, I just appreciate these words, this reminder. The checking on the spot becomes like, you're right. You're right. And they wouldn't be able to get away with these things if we were more militant and aggressive about holding the line, as I like to say. And so it's a good reminder. And yeah, sometimes I think about like how far can my work go if you're not theorizing from formation? You're just theorizing in the ether, and checking my own self. But you're right. It's profitable. This is unprecedented in the way it's profitable. And so it's about curtailing that, but also how do you bring people in? That's like the one thing that I think I offer is like a bridge. Like, how do you bring people in with the capacity and the potential? The street warriors, like you said, that just don't have the resources yet. That's the kind of front that how do you make the analysis of war the base, like the foundational analysis for people? I had a student say, oh, it would be crazy if I went home. Because the Black Lives Matter platform starts with end the war on, end the war on, end the war on, which to me is really interesting. Like, where did they get the language? What was the conversation? My student was like, if I went home and told my parents that I'm learning that there's a war on Black people, they would like flip their mind. But she's like, this is it. And so I'm like, how do I work as that bridge, but also that wall against when I occupy the position that, I don't know, facilitates the theft.
Look at it like this. Look at who we have to look at who we're studying, right? So we're talking about George and we're talking about Malcolm. How did they do it? You know what I'm saying? Sometimes we listening, we're hearing the words or we're reading the words and we're trying to get these ideas and these thoughts, you know, but you have to embody, right? You have to say, okay, boom, where was George when he became George? You understand what I'm saying? And what was he doing? What was he really into? Where was Malcolm when he became Malcolm? Right? They weren't in the academy, right? And it's not a diss to the academy. I'm just telling you, this is what we're talking about. So this is how we have to roll. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go all the way out and be just like them, but I'm just saying you in Christianity, they say that Jesus spoke the language of the people. That's one thing that you have to do. You have to speak the language of the people. You can't reach the people if you're not amongst the people, right? So everyone's not going to be on Guerrilla Intellectual University, right? So we have to say, okay, boom. One of the things that Bunchy Carter did out in LA was they would throw these discos and whatnot. And in the middle of the joint, when things is bumping and everybody's live, he'll stop the music, get up on the table and start teaching. He got enough crew with him. He has enough crew with him that you're not gonna I mean, you ain't going to be like, turn the music back on. I don't want to hear this. You know what I mean? You have to make this whole, when we're up against capitalism and we're up against imperialism, we have to match their fire. We have to match their flyness, right? We can't just walk around with, looking like, like we're trying to recruit someone into the culture. You have to use the cherry cough drop theory. You got to make it taste so good they forget it's medicine. You got to put a beat on it. You got to make it look fly. You understand what I'm saying? There's no rules that we have to be these poor righteous teachers where you have to look a certain way, you got to act a certain way, whatever. But you have to be able to reach the people where they are. And I think that that's where we fall short. And we allow these other individuals to stand up on their ivory towers, from their ivory towers, and tell you what the issues are. And because they have a publishing deal, then they're allowed to get away with certain things, because the press, the state's press, will allow them to be the spokesperson for us. But we have to denounce the press that they're coming from. So we got to go right to the root. Yes, this particular press joint, they also put out these books. This particular newspaper, they also put out this right here. How can you stand with them? How can you side with them and say that, you're representing what we're representing when this is something that George or Malcolm would have shunned? So we got to go from that particular angle.
If I can, I just want to throw something out, because I think I disagree slightly. Or I'm just in a different space, so I'm open to being checked on this, and so I just want to make this quick point. Then I'd like to just throw out a couple of others, and then sit back and continue to enjoy listening. I am less interested in trying to recruit and expand. I'm more interested in doing what I feel like we're doing here, which is building among those who are already so-called converted to a certain point, and figuring out how we can become more effective working with each other and become more disruptive. I've kind of, and this is why one of the points I wanted to ask you about is Joy, I see you constantly struggling with this, with Afro-pessimism. And I keep wanting to ask you why you aren't one, or why you feel like, as you said in this chapter, they've recruited you. Because, and I don't mean, and I think I'm misdefining my own interpretation of it when I say, I'm bringing that up to say that I wanted to say I feel like I'm in a more pessimistic moment in terms of trying to compete with empire. I don't think we can make it. We can't keep this idea. And in part because I've just been watching a lot of their product, trying to be critical of it. And I'm like, we're never going to.
Right.
Let me just finish this real quick, and then I'll just let you all go. Like we're never going to make a fly product like they make. We're never going to make Revolution look as fly as they make Selling Out look. We can't magnify what we're doing to match what they're doing. So what I would like to do is to say, for those of us who feel we've hit a certain level of again, conversion, or whatever we are, what does that sister say in Canada? Broken machines. I keep forgetting her name, but that we've become like the broken machinery. Like, how do we be more broken and more effective in breaking up the function of what's happening here? So I just want, I'll stop there, but if I can, I just want to throw out a couple of things I've been taking notes on that I'd love, so this question of Afro-pessimism, this question of fear, I just brought up in my class the other day, that from the other side, when you're talking about Jonathan, I've been stuck lately on Rochelle, and because I have no experience doing what Jonathan did. I have some experience being on the other side at 17, sitting in a courtroom, maybe wishing somebody rolled up there like Jonathan, but then wondering, what would I have done?
Right.
Would I have had the heart to overcome the fear to do what Rochelle did in response to that? Like, I could see just as easily saying, I don't want no parts of this. Don't hand me that gun. What you talking about? I might get out of here. I might get off. So that part, but anyway, so that what you said earlier about critical war studies, critical military studies, this unnamable war, I put on my moniker the guerrilla academic because in the chapter you define my actual experience of needing to raise money to get legal assistance to fight this university that's trying to crush me to this day. So like now I feel like I can officially call myself a guerrilla academic. You all gave me that definition. Thank you very much. Graveyard affirmations, captive maternalist function. I mean, just a lot of dope. I've really been enjoying it. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to throw that little bit out and thank you.
Yeah, I want to add to this because it was on my list of questions. Because Joy, you have like a tension between the function of leadership and then what I wrote, like it's vanguardism. So I wonder where you lie, because you have this ongoing, like decades-long critique of how leadership as a managerial like thing versus like where does the vanguard fit in for you, especially after this we're not leaderless, we're leaderful, and like the whole like horizontal, you know, the conversation for the past 10 years has been some kind of reactionary response to maybe the hyper hierarchy of militant formations in the 70s, but now we see that leaderless or leaderful might not deliver, but does a vanguard either? And it's kind of jumping off of this question. But so I'm wondering, I had a question about how you understand leadership, vanguard versus like mass or popular front.
Okay. Yeah, Kalonji, you were going to say something too?
Oh yeah, no, I was just responding to Jared. Basically, when I'm talking about matching, I'm not saying that we should go. You all hear me? I'm not saying we should go get gold chains and rims and all that type stuff. I'm saying that simply we don't have to be dusty. We don't have to act like, you know, we have to have this this image of being broken. You know, we can advance still. And when it comes to organizing, indeed, you know, as an organizer, you know, we have our cadre, but at the same time, you have to continue to advance. You have to continue. You need more people. You need more momentum. We'll die off. This has happened time and time again. So we must recruit. If we don't recruit, then eventually we will become encapsulated and broken, and we'll keep on this this cycle. That's just how I see it, coming from an organizational perspective. You know, so never am I saying that, you know, oh, we should be like the capitalists. No, I'm saying to you, whatever we have to do to gain the attention, there are folks out here right now. There's a revolutionary being born every day. P.T. Barnum said a sucker's born every minute. I say a revolutionary, a freedom fighter is being born every day. The conditions of capitalism, the conditions of imperialism, just how they roll will force you into a corner enough that eventually you might jump out and fight. They say people are born, come through this in one of three ways: inspiration, aspiration, or desperation. Unfortunately, for the most part, we've been desperate people. So we have to inspire. We have to say, okay, boom, me being on this platform with you all right now, I come from a certain space. Okay, so there's folks that's going to check this out and they feel like, you know what, well, man, you all broke it down in a different way, because sometimes we have a language barrier as well. We utilize certain terms. We grow accustomed to speaking the King's language, right? So we have to, like Malcolm said, speak the language of the people themselves. So that's all I'm saying when I'm talking about meeting and matching.
Yeah, I think yeah, I'm trying to think what I think. I spent part of the past weekend with a young Black person, actually several of them. And like when we walked into a restaurant, you know, heads would turn. And so I was trying to understand the glamour, if you will. And they explained to me later, they're in their 20s, right? And we were talking about organizing how to address District 79 in New York City, which is the school district for, you know, the kids in Rikers. So, I mean, I find the DOE to be problematic on many accounts in terms of delivering any form of intellectual or emotional care. But anyway, so we were trying to figure out what could be an intervention if we had some resources to work with different populations of youth, right? But then later, like after we finished lunch, you know, they broke down to me what glamour was, because I didn't quite get it, right? Because I don't do it. But they said it was a war strategy. And then that made me think that there are multiple war strategies. With that's not my war strategy, obviously, you can tell. But there are different war strategies to cope with the culture, to engage in defense, and also a form of offense. Because I noticed, like, when we went into another store area and then, they were middle-class whites, whatever, they resented the fact that the youth were so confident. And actually, it reminds me of, we have something in the chat that we'll come to in just a second. I just want to finish this. It reminds me of the Panthers, who had their contradictions, but the way in which they presented their uniform as a visual, right? Like the way in which the icon was the cat itself, what that stood for. I mean, we're people of imagination, of signs and symbols, and material struggle, right? And all that is woven into culture. So we started off, an hour and a half ago, talking about culture. And I think we can appeal to ourselves, our better selves, our devotional selves, our rebel selves, ourselves that are willing to engage in agape, which is love as political will. It's not, romantic love or familial love or love for your kids or love for stuff. It's your willingness to sacrifice, not because you want to, but because of the politics becomes a form of spirituality itself, if it's liberatory. So, I mean, what is a vanguard? I don't know. I try not to roll with them, because I did at one point. Like I knew, rolled with all the elites and stuff. It didn't work for me because I didn't find it to be honest. And it was so alienated, echoing what Kalanji said, it was so alienated from the base. I mean, I know where I teach, and I know my isolation is real, and so is my alienation. But I know enough to know that I am alienated. The problem with vanguards is sometimes they don't understand that they're alienated, right? And so I trust people who work in the community, who have bridges into the community, and to go back to what Jared says, and who take intellectual risk to challenge their own operational zone, known as the academy, to call people out on these different levels or metrics. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions, but I know we have two things in the chat, so I don't want to talk too much. So does anybody want to read that, Jared or Kalanji?
Well, the first one, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what violence targeting children is as mechanism for community control, mass deportations, maybe underworld. I'm not really sure what is being said there. I'm sorry, I'm confused by that one.
Maybe they could clarify when we go to the second one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the second one essentially is asking that they would love to see an extended series of discussions led by you and your guests, focused on the topics of today's discussions. So I might suggest that they just stay tuned and continue to watch. But
yeah, I would say I've been in touch with, and Felicia, I think I forwarded to you. I was also going to invite Khadijah. So again, here's the book. There's a thing called Night Bar School in the South, and they work with a group that works with incarcerated women in North Carolina. So we were going to do a free class, meaning that people pay or donate what they can afford, but all the proceeds would go to purchasing books for incarcerated women. And then again, I've been in conversation with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, because they were going to crowdsource, and they're also in this text. So there is a concern that, to the extent that our conversations are useful, or what we collectively produce, that we can share with people inside as well. Of course, we need to get them outside. But sometimes, even if it doesn't feel like enough, what we offer is some form of sustenance. I mean, for me, sometimes it's just about like, just keep people, let them hang on long enough to we turn a corner or get the resources, deliver the food, get the kids out of foster care, send money in for commissaries, hire attorneys to get people out, protest the state. What was the Panthers said, survival pending revolution or liberty. Yeah. And I don't always have to keep quoting them, right? Because it's what from just keeping your family members alive, right? Or Jarrett, your pet, happy and going to sleep at night, so other people can sleep in the household or other beings. So I don't know if I was answering the questions that y'all put out, but
the first one, admittedly, I'm not clear what's being asked. Something about violence targeting children as a mechanism of community control, and I think they're saying mass deportations in an underworld of our dead, but I'm not clear about that last part there.
Well, one thing I could say in terms of, so this is what we're able to do with the grant, Organizing the Academy on February 8th from 6 to 8 p.m. There's a conversation with Samaria Rice, the mother of the murdered 12-year-old Tamir Rice, Dawn Wooten, who was a whistleblower in terms of forced hysterectomies in ICE camps. And I think I've mentioned before, at least in Texas, disproportionately those targeted for violence would have been Haitians, Africans, people from Cameroon, right? So even though everybody's held captive, anti-Blackness is on steroids inside all zones of captivity. Also, Joyce McMillan, who's in Harlem, who organizes for the abolishment of foster care, disproportionately Black children removed from their families, even though there's no data at all, because it's not true, that we are more dysfunctional than other families. But again, if it's a Black child, you're more, you're going to be hyper targeted by the cops, by social workers, by teachers, by principals. We go down the list. And the last person is Amanda Wallace, who's in North Carolina, who was a social worker and then realized when they looked at the data and all these forced removals of Black children as a Black person, that this was corrupt, and they quit their job. But then they protested against a Black judge woman. It's kind of like Mumi's case, a Black woman judge who was just like signing all kinds of paperwork for trafficking, I'll call it that, trafficking people's babies and their kids. And when she protested at the house, the police came. And then again, that terrorist tag was going to be, leveled against Amanda Wallace. So those four Black intellectuals, Black fighters, Black rebels will be in dialogue at 6 p.m. February 8th. You can go to Williams College if you want to see the link. So I think there's so many different ways in which we understand maternity. But again, the captive maternal is a non-gendered construct. And it can be agendered, male, female, queer, whatever. It's your function as a caretaker. And like everybody on this call cares for and nurtures other people. It's not, there's no gender identity that determines our political will or our level of devotion. So I really appreciate, Felicia, you putting devotion on the table. Devotion doesn't belong to any particular gender, okay? And the willingness to sacrifice, to stabilize, to build, and also to protect. I see ourselves as war resistors. That's the highest stage of the captive maternal. About 4 or 5 stages. The first level, you're conflicted, caretaking, and then there's a comprador. Like Condoleezza Rice is not a captive maternal. Anybody who willingly works for empire isn't in another category. That's not the zone of devotion or care. But the war resistor is an inevitable formation if you continue to move forward, because the state comes from all forms of marronage, just like the master hunts, bounty folks to find the escapees, right? And again, when Rochelle is a co-defendant with Davis, they have 2 different arguments. For Davis, right? And I'm glad that that this one worked for them. As a citizen, they had a right to protection under the law. For Ruchell Magee, as a slave, they had a right to fugitivity. Ruchell was in the war. That is the war zone. That is it when it's actualized. Like, you know what this is. 13th Amendment codifies it. The predatory policing inside of prisons in the Terra does what the master likes, and the state pretending that they're not doing it, but the state is paying everybody to terrorize. And we're paying the taxes that allows the state to pay for terror, right? And so these contradictions, you know, I'm going to echo what's already been said. They can be addressed by intellectualism, but they're also addressed by the heart. Because I don't believe our mental capacity could deal with this without a spiritual template, even if it's just rooted in the love of family. I think we would just have serial breakdowns continuously, unless we had something that was transcendent. And I want to go back to what Felicia said, because I mean, like, Felicia, that was my next project. But then I was afraid I'd become depressed and an alcoholic. So I was simply going to study every clandestine, you know, President Johnson sending mercenaries in the 60s to take out freedom fighters in Africa to stabilize the apartheid regime. You know, I was just gonna like, okay, let me try to anticipate the curve, because I know y'all have a curve, and because you consume us, and then you bump yourself up to the next level, and then you sell our struggle back to us as simulacra. So what I want to do is I want to study the intellect for empire and predatory violence. I want to study the terrorists, but then it's like, I need to balance that off with something. Or, you know, if I'm going to do it as an individual, it's probably not healthy, but if we do it as collective. So when we move to, you know, 4 weeks of blood in my eye, and maybe Felicia, you know, you can come back or write in the comments or chat, whatever we're doing here. I just think we need each other. And for me, that would be the hardest spirituality, if we can agree that our ties to each other will be disciplined by devotion and not by just rapacious desire to be held and comforted, which you have a right to be, but that doesn't really work in a war. I mean, at some point, you just have to be emotionally stable enough to be productive. And then that becomes a form of comfort, because you see your agency in love and in physical practice on the ground.
Yes.
Right on.
Sounds awesome.
I think we had one more question that Janine dropped in the chat here. Some Afro-pessimists may believe that we absolutely have the capacity to win battles, as y'all know, but many seem unclear about. They may organize and participate in such wins as part of their political practice and political devotion. But what is to be said about Black people's capacity to win the war, which seems to never be won, and whose perpetual losing has become a weapon of containment? Here, it is a question of the capacity to win the war against empire as opposed to winning battles.
Before you all answer that, can you please, for folks who are just tuning in, and for some of our folks who are not familiar with that particular term, can you define Afro-pessimism? Because again, I think that one of the things that we must do is we should always approach this as if folks are new to movement, circles, culture, etc.
Yeah, right on. Thank you.
Felicia, you want to start, and then I'll just back up. I'll come second on AP. You're on mute. Are you on mute?
Yeah, I think she muted herself.
I'm muted. Felicia, you're muted. I can't unmute you. There you go. Sorry, there you go.
All right. I don't want to do them injustice because I don't think I'm as studied as I should be. But the things I've taken away are that the figure of the slave or the slave, the enslaved, that is a kind of enduring and it's an enduring, it's wedded to Blackness, that you cannot separate the two. And so perhaps thinking about the Black condition from the position of the slave in an ahistorical way. So throughout time, despite, structural arrangements, that ontological, so that being, that matter of like not class, not relation, or kind of these other ways we organize social or political communities, but this matter of Black being, a kind of essence of Blackness, is, I think, what they say, coterminous with the slave. And so what this framework then allows you to do is just maybe slow down. This is what it's helped me do, because I'm also like, I don't work through the paradigm from my work, but it has taught me to be a lot more precise if I'm going to posit a kind of structural change in the Black condition anywhere, to do so with greater precision and not out of the desire to see progress, but rather to make an argument that can prove one has actually moved out of the status of enslavement. And so I think critiques of that are that, the slave isn't just this one category that moves through time, that there are meaningful changes. There's like a lot of debate, but what it's attuned me to is that while slavery is that structuring condition that you cannot run away from because you fear it, because you fear what it would say about your positionality, and then terror, the degree of terror and the desire for terror that fuels this whole project. It's more than just an instrumental dispossession. There's pleasure. And it has that psychoanalytic dimension of like, what is the role of pleasure in maintaining these relations, and how, so not just the state, and this is also where I think I learn a lot, it's civil society. So the Afro-pessimist arrangement thinks about civil society and the state as equally captive. I think about the master, because it's like he just got lost. Like all of a sudden there are no more masters, as if that dimension of power didn't reproduce itself. They're really focused on civil society. So take away government, take away these like federal capacities, and you're still left with the same kinds of predation. Why is that? And what does like civil society needs our death? It needs for its own regeneration. I think those are some of the like operating terms. And it's a lot of pressure to not do convenient mind games with what we imagine has happened, with what we have achieved. I think they really direct you to be precise about the function, like what historical change actually is, as opposed to assuming it, which we often do, like progress. So it's told me to sit back and theorize like more robustly when I imagine something has structurally shifted, like enslavement to Jim Crow. What exactly is the nature of that shift? And am I assuming things that I desire to see, as opposed to like the structural continuities? I don't know. And then ontological is like that, really like the basis. It's not like a political relationship. It exists at a different, I think, as Wilderson says, order of abstraction. But I don't want to do them disservice. So
yeah, I would add too. I mean, not being one, but knowing them or reading them. So also there's a clip on YouTube, The Ontology of Betrayal, which graduate students conceived of, Rebecca M. Wilcox, T. Trotman, and Tasia Mars McDougall, I believe, right? Which if you're interested, you could check in. It's Frank Wilderson and Selma Terefe, right? And myself talking. So part of their analysis comes from Orlando Patterson, the Harvard sociologist. His book is Slavery and Social Death. And his politics are different. I don't think he's a radical thinker or organizer. And the architects of AP or Afro-pessimism, like Frank fought in the underground in South Africa. And it was Frank who taught me the distinction between Chris Hani and Nelson Mandela. And then once I got it, I couldn't drop it. So, the zone of betrayal, of course, is not just the exterior war of white overlords. It's also Black people who work with IMF or who want to stop a revolution, or, you know, because it's time for compromise, negotiation. And it's a complicated story. You guys can do more research or talk about that. But the things that were key for me is like, if Chris Hani is gunned down in his driveway, and supposedly only a few people in the ANC knew where he lived or where he would be at that moment, then that the Afrikaners could hire a white mercenary who kills them. And then again, reportedly, what I know could be wrong, check your facts, that this white mercenary mysteriously dies before he goes on trial, and he can say who told him where Hani's house was, right? That this becomes the complexity of our struggle, because I know the longer question is Afro-pessimism and how do you win the war? So this is a tangible loss, right? The devotion for Hani, I think, shapes Wilderson. So that decades later, when I'm doing one of these anthologies on political prisoners, and I have a piece from Jalil Muttaqim, and the piece, it talks about war, and I get timid because my academic colleagues are like, oh, you need to censor, edit down what Jalil writes. And I call Frank on the West Coast, and he's like, print the whole thing. And Jalil was like, do what you want. Like, I'm not going to try to police you, and I can't. I'm inside, right? But then I was like, okay, we're going to print the whole thing. So there are ways in which Afro-pessimism gives you the support to do what you're supposed to do. I wouldn't say that it is the complete matrix or a complete paradigm for devotion and struggle, but through Afro-pessimism, I started to distinguish anti-Blackness from white supremacy, anti-Blackness from racism, that those concepts of racism and white supremacy couldn't really deliver, you know, or explain what Felicia and all of us have been talking about for the last 2 hours. The specificity of violence that the master arrays against us is tied to chattel slavery, and the legitimization of chattel slavery is tied to Blackness and to the African. So sometimes Wilderson says it goes back to 1300 years. And then I think about when the Moors, the Muslims, like Africans, came over and took over Spain and Portugal, and they brought a lot, like civilization in the short term. But the resentment of the Moor, you know, you track it through, you know, Shakespeare, Othello, right? This template of the Black, once they're defeated in 1492 in January by the Spaniards, Isabella and Ferdinand, whatever, the royalty. In August is when Christopher Columbus gets his money to go, quote, find the New World and start sparking genocides, right? And the later the capture of Africans once they decimate indigenous populations. And I know, Felicia, you do this work around Black indigeneity, right? Coming from Sylvia Wynter. And so we have to talk about that later in the book that you're working on with Tony Bogues and Allegra, right? Yeah. So I learned from AP. I'm not sure I agree with them, because, and I think I'm going back again, my gratitude with devotion. I think that I want to be disciplined by devotion. I think they think more in psychoanalytic terms, but they have gifts to offer. In terms of winning a war, I don't even know if that's possible, like to win a war. Like win a war in a definitive way that the opposition doesn't come back. I mean, it is permanent war. And I think that's the hardest thing. Like, you want to win a war, we have a parade. I mean, that was like Obama in 2008. We won against this white supremacy because we got a Black president who also turned out to be an imperialist. Like, our wins are not exactly what they think or we think they might be. And so we have to remain constantly vigilant and always mobilized. And if you're always mobilized, then you know that these wins have to be protected. And so the wars never end because the aggressors never stop. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I would just add maybe that one of my chapters, I kind of divide it into these, they're not dichotomies, they're binaries, because they're not antithetical. Master and state, they're in relation, then earth and world, and body and consciousness. But for earth and world, the, you know, abstracting earth into submission, and I try to look at the history of cartography in the 1400s Africa is so central to developing a concept of open Euclidean space, just open space. It used to be theological space, like space granted by God, and the way the ecumen is what they called the Christian kind of unit was organized. Everything else was hellfire, water, until they breach Africa. And Africa allows them to open an imagination for open space, and it primes the new. It is the new world. Africa, the breach of Africa is a new world that we slip out of the North American New World. And this is all to say that the submission of Earth is deeply tied to anti-Blackness administratively, from conceiving the globe as an open, global, conquerable space to all the other things they've done to produce this level of ecocide. And so I think our battle has been so sutured to Earth now that it really is Earth versus world. And until Earth is liberated, that's how deeply I think anti-Blackness exists at all dimensions, that it's geological, it's environmental, of course, as we know. But I guess in winning the war, there's something about Earth, to me, Earth versus world. They want world to be synonymous with Earth. They want to be this thing that they created to be the terrestrial like fact, and it's simply not. It's overlaid, and they've divided and desecrated and manipulated Earth's surface and terrain, all of it. They've punctured it. So I guess in winning the war, I think unfortunately we've been backed into a corner, and this is why I'm saying with the more time that goes by, it's not like it's this benign and non-mutative force. It gets more powerful. Are we getting more powerful is the question. But it gets more powerful to the point now where I think like we as Black people are fundamentally sutured to Earth in a way. And I don't know what it means to liberate Earth, but that's kind of how in that chapter, Earth World, or this dynamic, how I want to take Earth back from them. But that also means that the scale of this problem it's terrestrial in a way that is unique to us as the cradle of life, literally in an evolutionary sense, throwing seeds and food and like all of that beginning, like that's not accidental to me. That the beginning is the thing that crushing the beginning is the thing they constantly reenact. To me, there's some kind of like existential thing there, but I don't know. So it's to say, I think we are so wedded to ecocide. We've been turned into nature in a number of ways, and I think there's a lot of work on that. But I don't know. I think it's a matter of Earth versus world. That's how deep it is, and I don't think we have to start maybe thinking on that scale, which is, I think, to the Afro-pessimist point, might exceed our capacity. That's what I like about, and I'm glad Janine's bringing this up, like capacity. It's that psychic, sometimes when you sit and you think about the magnitude of what was done, how disgusting, brutal, and administrative and bureaucratic it was. That conjunction, the administration and the abstraction of filth, I mean, that is psychically overwhelming. I have points where it does incapacitate me, because when you really stare at that beast in the eyes, it is overwhelming. And there's a psychic thing that goes on. So that's another thing I pull from them, is like to honor just how split, like Wanda Coleman, my favorite poet, says, I have a split psyche. My psyche is shattered. And she writes from that shattering. And that's why she's like, so that is something to keep in mind too. And that goes to Bob Marley, like mental slavery.
Thank you. I mean, I know we have to go, but this has been wonderful. And for the people who wrote in your questions and comments, so sorry we didn't get to them, but please keep commenting and we'll try to pick up. Natality you brought to the table, and our capacity to rebirth ourselves and the world is endless, and to defend ourselves from predatory states, masters, formations as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And I know, Kalanji, did you want to wrap it?
Yeah, Felicia, this was a awesome convo. Definitely appreciate you coming on. I say we draft you as a co-host, but that's just me. You know what I'm saying? It's good to have good to have the energy. And I love the balance, because I think that we often talk about, when we're talking about war, it's either physical or mental. And so many folks leave the spiritual aspect out of it. And when you talk about Earth versus world, we can guarantee that there will be a war bigger than us. And I think that right now, these folks are helping to push it along. And you know, the term beast is an understatement. But you know, with a beast of this magnitude, of this nature, it requires extermination. And I think that there are certain words that we like to shy away from and we don't want to use because, you know, it sounds like, you know, well, that sounds bad. I mean, but they do to us what we are afraid to think about being done to them. You understand what I'm saying? It's like our fear is so deeply embedded that we don't even want to think about how to properly respond, you know, which is sad. It is a
Okay,
sad
so
thing.
sorry. So the word just came to mind is we have to come back and talk about cyborgs then, because the level of technology that's interfacing with the human has altered the human, the so-called human, and we're supposed to not be there. But okay, so yeah, and more to discuss. Janine Jones, thank you so much for helping with crafting,
Yes.
shaping, handling the queries. Again, our apologies. But yeah, more continued discussion and more. Maybe we will focus a lot when we do blood and my eye or our eyes. So
Yeah.
please look forward to the 4-part, you know, and the link to the book itself,
Yeah.
and we'll pick up where Kalanji left off.
Yeah. So look inside of the for folks who are checking us out online, look inside of the description. Get your books, Blood in My Eye. As Joy mentioned, we will start on the 20th, February 20th, which would be the day before the assassination of El Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. On the 20th, we'll have Zach Kondo, who is one of the foremost authorities in regards to the life and assassination of Malcolm. I know that next week, who do we have on board next week, Joy?
Max
The
Parthas, leading abolitionists against the 13th Amendment. So the master is tied to the state. Thank you for the language, Felicia. In terms of their form of abolition, they've
Yes.
gone from state to state to get individual states to nullify or throw out the 13th Amendment that legalizes slavery if you've been convicted of a crime. And Louisiana said, no, we want to keep slavery in the states, but other states have like rejected. I think there's about 11 so far who are, you know, not willing to pay people to be firefighters or whatever for 27 cents an hour or 60 cents or whatever the exploitation rate, which is actually slavery rate, is going on now.
Right now. We'll be back next week. Guerrilla Intellectual University. Make sure you share this, subscribe, like it. That's all the cool things they say in YouTube world. Also, if you do not mind, leave us a comment in the comment section. I think I kind of like it this way without the without chat on this particular piece on GIU, because I think that it allows us to focus a little more on what's going on. So
Substantive.
definitely.
You guys wrote some really challenging and insightful
Yeah.
queries, and please keep doing that. I mean, and we'll figure
Yeah,
out a
so
rhythm where we can incorporate as many.
mhm.
But yeah, you bumped it up. So thank you to everybody who wrote in. You bumped it up to another level.
Yes, thank you very much. Felicia, we'll see you next time.
Stay on this,
You all be
Felicia.
safe.
All
Ready for
right.
revolution. GIU.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Am I the
I'm still here. Are you here, Joy? Oh,